Max Verstappen has been one of the most vocal drivers when it comes to the 2024 calendar, and it seems like the Dutchman is not a huge fan of having a 24 race-filled year in his life. But with the sport continuing to push towards this agenda more and more, Verstappen made sure to send out a fierce warning to the entire F1 world. On top of that, he pointed out a serious sprint race problem that turns out to be the general belief of the majority of the grid. While there are some team bosses that don't agree with Verstappen on his take on the 24 race calendar, the uprising from the drivers is the hottest talking point in the sport right now. So the question is whether or not the FIA would bend under the pressure and the rebellion led by the three-time world champion and the current superstar of the sport, Max Verstappen. It's safe to say that Formula One's expansion has been everything Liberty Media has worked towards from 2017 onwards, and while they did achieve it with quite a lot of success, it did not come without its own consequences. The financial sides that were massively involved in expanding the sport's reach in the USA and the countries of Saudi Arabia and Qatar have rightfully asked for a more direct involvement in the sport, which resulted in 2 new venues in the USA and the implementation of Jeddah and the Qatar GP in 2021. All of this maxed out the calendar for 2024 to 24 races, something that was supposed to happen in 2023 as well, had it not been for the cancellation of the Chinese GP and the Imola GP, and this is not going to end well for the drivers on the grid. The president of the GPDA, George Russell, fears that the crew the sport brings along is not going to withstand the pressure that the calendar is going to bring, suggesting that the sport should consider a rotating crew for the upcoming season. But contrary to him, Verstappen believes there shouldn't be any discussion about whether or not a 24 race calendar is sustainable in the sport. In his words, it's not, and it should not happen in the future. While many have criticised the Dutchman due to the fact that he's paid millions to do his job, the dangers that the F1 sport brings are like no other sport, and the opinions of the drivers should be more valued by the FIA. When talking about this matter, the Dutchman said, "The 2024 should definitely have fewer races. For me, we have too many, but we are not the ones who decide, not even the FIA. But I would always argue in favour of fewer races and more quality, and the teams only if they are of good quality and not just filling up the field." It's safe to say that Verstappen is also not that big of a fan of Andretti, at least not from a general point of view. And while the American company is on the brink of entering the sport, the Dutchman is actually very close to quitting F1 if it continues to move in a direction he doesn't feel is suitable for his lifestyle. While Verstappen is definitely one of the most disciplined drivers on the grid, driving in the simulator in his free time, visiting 24 races in a year and having 22 cars on the grid do seem like a bit too much for him, even though the sport did race with 24 cars at a certain time in the past. Regardless, this is not the only issue that Verstappen has with the sport. The current format of the sprint race is also something that he's been very vocal about. For Verstappen, the current version of the sprint races, which is more or less a shorter format, takes away some of the magic of Sunday's Grand Prix. And the main issue is quite simple. The cars are locked into Parc Fermé after FP1, and they're unable to be worked on for the entirety of the weekend. Furthermore, Verstappen went on to say, "I've always said that I understand the business side, but I look at it as a pure racer. It takes away some of the magic. When I switched on the TV as a kid, I used to wonder with excitement what was going to happen in this race. As a fan, you don't have all the inside information on tyre degradation or anything like that. You see a Red Bull, Mercedes and Ferrari on the grid, and you wonder how it's going to end. A sprint race more or less lets you know what's going to happen the next day, unless there are crazy circumstances. For example, a change in the weather. Normally, you can judge the race pace after a sprint. I think that takes the tension away. Maybe the start is still exciting." Obviously, the FIA has listened to Verstappen and other prominent drivers like Alonso, who also have a huge issue with a 24-race calendar and are alarmed that this could drain his energy when it comes to racing deep in his 40s. But what changes are bound to be implemented? As of now, the governing body is keen to accept the proposal made by the team principals later this month, and the most important change is that the qualifying shootout for the sprint race would happen on Friday and the 100-kilometre race on Saturday morning. happening just prior to the qualifying for the main event on Sunday. The current format, on the other hand, has the qualifying for the main Sunday's event happening on Friday, with sprint qualifying and a standalone race taking place on Saturday. This doesn't allow the teams to work on their cars after FP1, which is a 1 hour long session that takes place on Friday, and that's why we saw many of the teams reverting to their pre-race setups after failing to achieve the results with their new upgrades in this limited time, as was the case with Aston Martin and Haas in Austin. According to Verstappen, the current format is very hectic and needs to be changed immediately, and when talking about this, he continued to say, "The format is generally quite hectic. I don't mind only having one practice session before qualifying, but the new qualifying for the sprint, that does not give me much because we'd already done the big qualifying session. That's the important session. In the sprint, the winner only wins 8 points. The differences between second or third are not big. It doesn't make much difference. You lock the setup after the first practice session. If you're wrong, you're trapped in that car setup for the rest of the weekend. That sucks. That happened to us last year in Brazil. This year, we had a couple of good sprint weekends. Nevertheless, I wasn't completely satisfied. With the ground clearance in Austin, for example, Mercedes and Ferrari certainly didn't set their cars too low on purpose." So with these issues, which team principal feels like Verstappen is in the wrong, at least for the 24 race calendar opinion? Fred Vasseur has tried to calm the entire F1 world by saying that this should not be that big of an issue to tackle, and the only worry that the fans should have is that the legendary circuits of Suzuka, Monza and Silverstone will remain on the calendar for a longer period of time, as they are currently facing extermination due to the increased interest in the street circuits. Elaborating on this, the team principal of Ferrari said, "We need to have the best approach for the mechanics because it's part of the performance, it's part of the reliability. It was not strange that there were more mistakes in the pit stops in Abu Dhabi than some other races. I think everybody was exhausted. It means that we need to think about perhaps having a rotation in terms of the mechanics, or to keep some mechanics to do the races and to have another group of mechanics at home taking care of the cars when they are back at the factory. I think we have room to do something. We have room to manage it in a better way. We have to keep in mind that a couple of years ago we were struggling to find tracks and to find events. Today, we have a lot of proposals that we have a situation to be able to do 24 events and also to be probably a bit more selective on the events. We have to work on the calendar for sure." On the other hand, Horner is not very sure that Vasseur is in the right here, saying that the sport is a travelling circus, but it's a global one, and it is their job to make sure that the people involved in this circus will be protected at any cost. If money is the only thing that drives these changes, then Horner's stance is adamant and firm. It should not come at the expense of human health and well-being. With this in mind, what do you think about Verstappen and Horner's take on the 24 race calendar in 2024? Let us know what you think in the comments below.